right, I think we're ready to get going. Thank you so much for being here on this afternoon. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marion Hourdequin, who's going to give a talk to us about climate change and intergenerational ethics, the challenge of moral ambivalence. I'm just going to say a few words about Dr. Hourdequin's general background and kind of research, to kind of place this a little bit, because I think this is very much at the center of Dr. Hourdequin's current research. She's actually a professor at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and her work really does focus on environmental philosophy in general, on ethics, comparative philosophy, philosophy of science, and especially recently also there's a strong focus on climate ethics, climate justice, intergenerational ethics, and relational approach to ethics. And she's also currently working on a book that is called What Individuals Should Do About Climate Change. So I think that kind of really addresses the question that most people have about this issue. And she has published numerous articles and books, but I'm just going to name two. One is Environmental Ethics from Theory to Practice, and the other one, co-authored with David Havlik, is on restoration, called Restoring Layered Landscapes. She also serves as the president of the International Society of Environmental Ethics and is the associate editor of the related journal called Environmental Ethics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hourdequin.
Thanks again, Thomas. Thanks for being here today. If any of you were also here this morning, thanks for subjecting yourselves to 2 talks from me in one day. I really appreciate your being here this afternoon. And a chance to share this work. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts and your comments and your feedback on this project. So. The title of my paper is Climate Change and Intergenerational Ethics, the Challenge of Moral Ambivalence, and hopefully the meaning of the subtitle will become clear as I go through the presentation, but I want to think about and talk about the relationship between climate change and intergenerational ethics, and I'll start by kind of stating the obvious, which is that climate change is an intergenerational issue. The impacts of climate, obviously, we're experiencing climate change now because of things that happened in the generations prior to us, modes of industrialization and fossil fuel burning that have occurred for many, many decades now. And the impacts of climate change, obviously, are also quite intergenerational. Similarly, our responses to climate change will need to be intergenerational. So the project or projects of decarbonizing the economy as a way of responding to climate change is going to be something that has to take place over time. So basically, climate change was put into motion by processes, institutions, ways of thinking and acting that preceded those of us alive today, and that condition our contributions and responses to it, and the effects are going to be multi-generational and long-lasting. So from a philosophical perspective, then it seems like we might ask, well, what does philosophy have to say about intergenerational ethics? Might there be some resources to help us think about this intergenerational ethical challenge that we face? And here I want to just suggest that although I think this is changing, for a long time the kind of dominant ways of thinking about intergenerational ethics and intergenerational relations, especially within analytic philosophy, have, in my view, been somewhat limited. There's been a lot of discussion of whether it's possible to have obligations to not yet existent people, for example. I think there's been much less attention to thinking about if we do have intergenerational obligations, what shape those obligations might take, and how they might actually be sort of borne out in practical action. I also want to point out that there are many other traditions sort of outside of like Western, sort of mainstream Western analytic philosophy that have more resources to offer in relation to intergenerational ethics. So many indigenous traditions, I think if you were here this morning, as you may have heard, think in a very multi-generational way 7 generations in the future. Other traditions, I think about themselves as located sort of in the middle with 3 generations behind and 3 generations ahead. Dominant ethical theories are limited, and I think it's also the case that our institutions, dominant institutions, are not highly intergenerationally oriented. Just to take one example, think about political systems in the United States, right? Tend to operate on pretty short time scales, not very focused on what's going to happen 10 years, 20 years, 100 years hence. Okay, so I do think, though, that we can have a starting point for thinking about climate change and intergenerational ethics through an analysis that Steve Gardner offers on this topic. And so that's kind of where I'm going to start. So Steve Gardner is a philosopher at University of Washington, and he's written a book on climate change as sort of a perfect moral storm. And Gardner's idea is that climate change is a especially challenging moral problem because it has dimensions that make it kind of complex and difficult to pin down, and also make it difficult to actually address in a sort of like focused, effective, and serious way. So one dimension of this moral storm that Gardner describes is that what he calls the global storm. The idea here is that the causes and effects of climate change are actually dispersed in space and time, right? So if I, turn my thermostat up to 75 in the winter to stay nice and cozy warm, right? Like that might be drawing power from natural gas, right? That natural gas, when that's burned, it releases fossil fuels into the atmosphere. But in terms of like who's specifically is affected by my turning up the thermostat, almost impossible to know, right? Like the only reason that my turning up the thermostat on a given day or every day all winter has an impact is because of the cumulative effects of everybody else's emissions, which interact with atmospheric systems in super complex ways. So that leads to what Gardner calls sort of the fragmentation, or that's tied into, I guess, what Gardner calls the fragmentation of agency. There's no sort of single agent that's like responsible for climate change, causally or morally. Then there's also the intergenerational storm, which is really the focus, my focus today. And the idea here is that each generation, according to Gardner, kind of benefits from emitting fossil fuels into the atmosphere. We get power, we can drive cars, we can ship goods all over the world and have cool computers that you can use to project PowerPoints and stuff like that. So those of us who are consuming fossil fuels today benefit from this. But a lot of the kind of costs end up being externalized to future generations because emissions today, there's sort of lagged effects in the climate system. So emissions today are going to impact, not just the climate now, but really have greater impacts on climate down the road. Right? It takes a while for warming atmosphere to actually have impacts like melting ice sheets and things like that. So in light of that, Gardner argues that it's actually sort of tempting for each generation to just postpone climate action, take the benefits now, and sort of leave the costs for the future. So that's one of the issues that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail. Gardner also thinks there's sort of a theoretical storm, and what he means by that is that we don't have the kinds of theoretical resources to really grapple with this problem. For example, we don't have, at least in many of the dominant cultures, really good resources for thinking about intergenerational ethics and institutions that actually embody those. Okay, so let's take a little bit closer look at the intergenerational storm. I already mentioned sort of the lagged climate effects and how those contribute to the storm. I already mentioned how it's sort of tempting for each generation to sort of exercise what Gardner calls the tyranny of the contemporary, sort of over future generations who don't really have any power yet, like not yet existent people can't really easily hold us accountable. And this results in these temptations to do sort of small things about climate change, like create climate agreements that don't really have any real teeth or real accountability, but then to sort of celebrate those and like pat ourselves on the back and think like, yeah, we're doing a great job here, but really can sort of continue with business as usual in a lot of ways. Together, these elements lead to what Gardner calls intergenerational buck passing. Basically taking the climate, each generation sort of taking the climate problem and passing it on to the next. So, okay, so one concern I have, I think this analysis is apt in many ways, but I do have some concerns about the moral storm analysis. And specifically, I'm worried that this sort of storm analysis might generate its own weather, by which I mean that I think the intergenerational buck passing can have kind of self-reinforcing dynamics. So if we think of ourselves as being sort of generationally isolated from those before us and those after us, then we'll be more likely to act in ways that are consistent with intergenerational buck passing. So when we get this analysis that tells us it's in our interest to emit a lot of fossil fuels now and to postpone action because future generations will have to deal with it, it might be tempting to start thinking that way. So I kind of worry about some of the individualism, the kind of game theory framing, the idea of insurmountable ethical obstacles that are kind of embedded in the analysis. And I should just mention that Gardner doesn't think that we should sort of stick with intergenerational buck passing. Like, he thinks this is something we need to address. But I just worry that the analysis may, if it causes us to think in sort of an individualistic frame, it may be self-reinforcing in certain ways. Okay. So I've been thinking about intergenerational buck passing and thinking about what exacerbates it and what might disrupt it, okay? So my view is basically that at the root of, I'll just call it IGBP because it's kind of a mouthful, is a fundamentally misguided way of conceiving our relations with one another and the broader world, in which well-being is viewed primarily as a limited resource and a zero-sum game. And I think that this problematic view applies both across space and across time, where individual welfare is viewed as distinct from the well-being of other current people and ecological systems, and also individual well-being is often viewed as distinct from past and future people, ecological systems, and societies. Okay. So I'm not gonna give you sort of like a full argument for this idea that IGBP is a result of this kind of problematic view of well-being as a zero-sum game, but I want to give you a sense of kind of an assumption or intuition that underlies my analysis. So what I am going to do is to try to give you a clearer picture of the problematic patterns that I think can reinforce intergenerational buck passing, and also offer some suggestions about how this pattern of sort of constantly handing off the climate problem to the next generation might be disrupted. Okay, so that requires that we think a little bit more about intergenerational buck passing. What are its key features? What are some examples in relation to climate change? What's at the root? And what would be needed to disrupt it? So the real question, the sort of deep, big question is, how might we get from a buck-passing world to a world in which intergenerational relations matter within dominant global institutions, economies, and ethical frameworks? Or I could say within global institutions, or institutions, economies, and frameworks at multiple scales, from local to global. So to sort of get at some of these questions, I want to take a look at the moral psychology of intergenerational buck passing. So what is going on, like, in our moral psychologies that sort of promotes this ongoing pattern? And I'm interested in thinking about this by kind of making a rough and kind of schematic distinction between generations. I mean, in practice, generations are overlapping, they're not like discrete and so on, but I think it might be helpful for our purposes today to sort of think of focus in on sort of two broad generational groups. One would be sort of people like in my generation who are currently particularly empowered to address climate change because we're embedded in systems in various ways in which we have some access to power. I do recognize that, there's a lot of heterogeneity among people of a given generation, and so not everyone has equal access to power and so on, but I'm focusing on people who actually, I think everyone has some power, but I'm focusing on people who are particularly well-positioned to affect change. And then on sort of younger generations, or sort of what I kind of like to describe as the generation that's kind of coming into power, right? Folks who are many of you who are young adults who are entering into the world, entering into institutions where you'll have power and influence. And I want to think about the relations also between these two groups. Okay. So as a kind of rough schema, I think there are certain characteristics or features that can contribute to IGBP among those of us who are sort of currently particularly empowered. These include investment in the status quo, fear of change, failures of imagination, orientation toward individualism and zero-sum thinking, and parochial intergenerational concerns focused on the preservation of wealth and power. And by this last point, I mean that when people, at least in sort of, what I want to just call in very broad brushstrokes, like the dominant culture, when we think about future generations, often the thinking and the institutions that exist around intergenerational relations are pretty narrow. Like, they're focused on, say, transmitting wealth, from within a family from one generation to the next. Not really focused on sort of how to ensure, that people generally 50 years from now are flourishing, okay? And we have laws that sort of protect and support that kind of intergenerational wealth transfer within families, but less institutional support for transferring wealth in ways that create more equitable distributions of wealth over generations. Among younger generations, I think some of the characteristics that may reinforce this same pattern are the development of anger, resentment, disillusionment, lack of solidarity, and hopelessness. Some of which I think are sometimes directed toward or in response to the kind of inaction of prior generations. Lack of role models and visible alternatives to the status quo, a sense that there's a lack of reciprocity between generations, and also lack of constructive outlets for action, and a feeling of tension between status quo expectations and the need for transformative change. So I'll say more about each of these things as we go forward. Now, I think one thing I want to sort of talk about is how, I'll just say a little bit more on this slide before I go on. I think there are a lot of people who, people in my generation, say, have different orientations toward climate change, right? So some are very actively committed to the status quo and have vested interests in sort of stasis with respect to climate change, keeping fossil fuels coming out of the ground, say, for example. Others are kind of indifferent or uninterested in climate change, and neither of these groups are the folks that I really want to focus on. I think there are a lot of people who actually care about climate change, but are nonetheless kind of complicit in intergenerational buck passing. And I would identify myself as sort of part of this group, and I think many of us who teach at colleges and universities are kind of positioned in this way, which is not to say that we're not doing anything to address intergenerational buck passing, but also that I think we in various ways are contributing to it. So this is kind of really my focus. Okay. So for people in this group, people who care about climate change but are sort of like invested in status quo institutions that perpetuate structures that contribute to climate change, what I want to suggest is that moral ambivalence actually plays a key role in supporting and shoring up IGBP. So I want to say a little bit about what moral ambivalence is, how I'm understanding it, what it looks like in this context, and then talk about some patterns associated with moral ambivalence that I think play a role in supporting, sustaining, and kind of transmitting intergenerational buck passing. And then I'll close by talking about some ways in which I think these patterns maybe can be disrupted. Okay, so I actually take the idea of moral ambivalence from David Wong, who wrote about it. He's a moral philosopher and comparative philosopher who wrote about this idea in his book Natural Moralities, which is actually a book about metaethics and pluralistic moral relativism. I'm not going to use it in exactly that way, but I think the concept is helpful. So what Wong talks about is how he sort of characterizes moral ambivalence as recognition of severe conflicts between important values and the possibility that reasonable people could take different paths in the face of these conflicts. Okay, so let me give you an example to sort of illustrate what he has in mind. Like you can imagine that two people disagreeing about how much emphasis to place on individual freedom versus community responsibility or something like that. And you can actually imagine also at the level of cultures that different cultures might place, might kind of weight these values differently. What Wong's point is that when we engage with people or with cultures that have sort of different modes of weighting values, it's often the case, if we're sort of sympathetic listeners, and that we can understand why that might be the case, right? Even though we ourselves might not prioritize values in that way. So, like, when I study classical Chinese moral philosophy, and in that tradition, filial piety, sort of a kind of respect and reverence to one's elders, to one's parents, to one's elder siblings, is really central to the Confucian tradition. That wasn't central to my tradition growing up, but I can still sort of understand how that might make sense, right? That somebody would place weight on that value. So what Wong is talking about here is this idea that even if we weigh values in different ways than other people, we can sort of understand how it might make sense to put the emphasis in a different place. And so why is this relevant to climate change? I think it's because in our own lives, those of us who are concerned about climate change often have the experience of moral ambivalence. We often have conflicting values, and often may feel like it's hard to figure out how to reconcile them and how to figure out which value should take priority over the other. And I think this is in part because there are actually fundamental tensions between current institutions, economies, ways of living, and dominant values on the one hand, and the actions and forms of restructuring that are needed to respond to climate change on the other. So people concerned about climate change often feel like caught in the middle. They may feel conflicted and ambivalent, and my suggestion is that this ambivalence can play out intergenerationally. So I just want to give there was a study by Michael Carillon at Colorado State University that sort of characterizes some of these feelings of conflict and ambivalence, and I'll give you a couple quick examples. So these are from interviews that he did with folks in the community in Fort Collins. And so the first person says, "I have no problem discussing with you my feelings about climate change. Yet when we start talking about my actions and how they're disconnected from my beliefs, it's sort of embarrassing because it makes me out to be a hypocrite where I say one thing but do another. So obviously I have mixed feelings about it. I say I feel strongly about climate change, but obviously I must deep down have conflicting views, otherwise my actions would be more in line with my words. And then here's a second subject, interview subject. I have a friend who thinks because I drive a car and use a dishwasher and clothes dryer that I'm being hypocritical when I self-identify as an environmentalist. This isn't being hypocritical, it's being an American. No, I'm serious. I mean, we live in a society that makes it next to impossible to do the right thing as far as the environment is concerned. We have to drive. We're pinched for time, so we need modern labor-saving conveniences. I have responsibilities to my family that keep me from rejecting the modern lifestyle, even though this lifestyle has considerable ecological implications. So we see like concern about climate change, but also concern about family. Like, I gotta get my kids to school. I gotta get them to their after-school activities, you know. I need the clothes washer to do laundry each week. Okay. So I think this moral ambivalence actually can lead us into certain patterns that sort of further contribute to intergenerational buck passing. And I want to talk about 3 of these, basically. So the first is what I call the handoff approach. And I'm thinking that many of you will find this familiar, right? So the handoff approach is basically an approach where people like me or others in my generation in particular spend a lot of time diagnosing the problem of climate change and then sort of turn it over to the next generation to solve, right? So perhaps, you know, you've been to talks where people say like, here's like all the bad stuff that's happening in the world, right? It's, you know, it's really dire. I'm gonna, you know, show you a bunch of graphs about like, you know, how we've messed up the nitrogen cycle and what's happening with sea level and so on. But then say at the end, but your generation is gonna solve it, right? And then, you know, all done. So I think this is a pretty common approach that appears not only in climate-related books and articles, but also in climate pedagogies. Like I think in our teaching about climate change, we sometimes also tend to take this approach, and that taking seriously the multidimensional, practical, personal, and emotional dimensions of climate change might actually call for something more and something different. The second pattern is perpetuating and actively reproducing the status quo. And this is one like I actually feel in a fairly acute way, because all of us are embedded in institutions, and we play a role. Like as a college professor, I play a role in, you know, teaching classes, educating people, getting folks sort of ready to head out into the world, right? But there are a lot of ways in which I think the educational system is basically training people to participate in an unsustainable world. So, I mean, this morning we heard about one of the speakers on one of the panels talked about how in our culture of busyness, for example, we don't have time to or we don't feel like we have time to actually make sustainable choices, or we might not feel like we have time to get engaged in a community group. I think, you know, insofar as educational institutions sort of contribute to this culture of busyness, like I'm complicit in this pattern of actively reproducing the status quo. The last pattern is what I call there is no alternative thinking, or TINA thinking. And this is a way of thinking that really limits the possibilities for change. So when people say things like, people will never give up their cars, right? Of course we shouldn't invest in public transportation because like it's just a fixed reality that people will never change their behavior around cars. Well, I mean, maybe, maybe not. Like maybe if there were better alternatives, people would change their behavior around cars, and if they didn't need cars to get places. I think another place that this shows up is in campus, like climate divestment movements. So often when students work together to advocate for university endowments to divest from fossil fuels, and they present their ideas, say, to the Board of Trustees, the response is, we can't do that. There's no alternative to investing in fossil fuels, because if we change our investments, we won't make as much, money for the endowment, and everything will suffer, and we have a fiduciary responsibility as trustees to actually, keep investing in the way we have been investing, right? There's actually now evidence that suggests that you can divest from fossil fuels and not take a hit in terms of returns. So that's false, but there's a kind of narrative of there is no alternative to the way that we've been doing things that I think sort of just cements this pattern of intergenerational buck passing. So I think the response to this is to open up to different diagnoses of the problem, different perspectives and frames, and get outside these kind of frames that sort of just constantly reinforce ways of doing things that are sort of business as usual status quo frames. I think for younger generations, as inheritors of intergenerational buck passing and sort of the moral ambivalence of the currently empowered, this creates structural, ideological, emotional, ethical, and practical challenges, I think, to constructive change. I think it's sort of understandable that to feel frustration, for example, in response to hearing just diagnoses of the problem without suggestions of constructive ways forward. And I think it's also understandable that, if older generations are kind of constantly reproducing the status quo, that it might feel to younger generations like there aren't a lot of different paths forward, a lot of different ways to engage in the world. So I think we actually need to get through this, we actually need to face our ambivalence and sort of think of different ways of responding. So think about how might, like, I, as somebody in a generation that's involved in education, say, how might I contribute to developing structures that actually provide alternatives rather than just sort of reinforcing the unsustainable patterns that we've been embedded in. I think I also want to give an example related to climate justice and indigenous climate justice. And this example draws on a piece by Kyle White called White Allies, Let's Be Honest About Decolonization. And I actually found this piece fairly pointed, but also very provocative and valuable. So I'll read the quote from White. He says, "Decolonizing allyship requires allies to be critical about their environmental realities and about the purpose of their environmentalism. To do this, allies must realize that they are living in the environmental fantasies of their settler ancestors. Settler ancestors wanted today's world." So I think what White is saying there is it's not just sort of like a coincidence, right, that, or some sort of contingent fact, right, that indigenous people were removed from the land, from their homelands, that cultural assimilation policies that involved sort of sending young indigenous children to residential schools where they weren't allowed to speak their language, killing off bison and other animals on which, and altering all ecologies in ways that made indigenous hunting and foodways less sustainable. Like that just didn't sort of just randomly happen. Like there was actually a systematic plan to engage in those practices in order to make North America like a place for European settlers. So I think what White is saying is that if we really want to think seriously about climate justice, we need to face the kind of ambivalence that, for those of us who are settlers, the kind of ambivalence that comes from this positionality as having benefited from practices that were deeply unjust, and figure out whether we're really committed or not, to fundamental and systemic change. So I think, there are ways forward, and I think by actually acknowledging, naming, recognizing the patterns that kind of perpetuate intergenerational buck passing, I think it's possible to disrupt it. I think it's also possible to find intergenerational bridges and to conceptualize ourselves differently rather than sort of thinking of each generation as kind of some kind of discrete entity that seeks to benefit itself at the expense of other generations. We can think of ourselves as kind of always already engaged in intergenerational communities. But I think in doing that, we also need to recognize that there are sort of ongoing tensions and challenges that need to be addressed. So I think moral ambivalence is a challenge, in my view, in responding to climate change. But there's also an upside to moral ambivalence. Maybe hard to confront, but it is ambivalent, right? And that the fact that we feel conflicted, or that some of us may feel conflicted, actually provides, choice. And it provides the possibility that we might think about how the world could be sort of differently configured so that multiple values that are currently conflicting might actually be simultaneously realized. So, the ambivalence suggests that those of us who feel ambivalent, I think this emotion suggests that we're not actually entirely attached to status quo values, structures, and institutions, and that kind of creates an opening for change. So intergenerational buck passing patterns can be disrupted. The currently empowered can reject the handoff approach, loosen attachments to the status quo, empower and learn from younger generations, and imagine and enact alternatives in partnership with others. And my hope would be that these steps might help to develop intergenerational communities and also richer conceptions of intergenerational relations. So by actually changing the way we think, changing what we do, change our institutions, we might also change the way we think about intergenerational relations and develop better theoretical resources to address the kind of theoretical storm that Gardner talks about. So to kind of have just a couple more thoughts before I bring the talk to a close, I think it's important to think about our responses to climate change in a kind of process-based, ongoing way. What I mean by that is that climate change isn't going to be something that's going to be sort of solved in a, like this. It's not just going to be one person. It's not going to be one institution. It's not going to be one country. It's not going to be, one treaty. So drawing from Donna Haraway, what I think is important is that we cultivate a sense of what she calls responsibility, or the ability to respond. It's a kind of capability to respond that needs to be developed. And we can develop that capability through action. So I'm just going to sort of speak from my perspective primarily as a teacher. I think there are ways that as teachers, those of us who are teachers, can actually work to confront ambivalence, disrupt intergenerational buck passing, and support climate action. And I want to offer a few suggestions along those lines. So the first suggestion is what I call scaling climate change. So a number of years ago, Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom wrote a piece in which she argued for what she called a polycentric approach to climate change. Now that might sound like, whoa, what's polycentric? Basically, that just means we should tackle climate change at multiple scales. And not just at the international level, not just at the individual level, but think about all the scales in between, right? So that's, city councils, state legislatures, community groups, bowling leagues, right? Like all of those places are places where we can develop responses to climate change. So what can happen in colleges and universities? What can happen in cities? What can happen at the level of regions? How does climate change intersect with issues of food justice and food sovereignty? There are lots of things lots of ways, because climate change is such a broad problem, there are actually lots of opportunities to address it, which I think is kind of a cool thing. And it's also the case that when responses are developed at one level, those things can be, we can learn from those and others can copy them, So if there's, let me go back to divestment. Like when people first started talking about climate divestment of university endowments, everybody was like, no, it's impossible. Then more and more and more and more institutions actually started doing it. So now it's become thinkable, it's become possible. And when people go and advocate for it, they can point to a whole bunch of examples. Well, Princeton just did it, right? They're not exactly like, that's my alma mater, so like I feel like I can sort of call them out a little bit. They're not actually like the most progressive institution on the planet, right? So, if they can do it, why can't other institutions? I think it can also be really helpful to develop community partnerships to kind of look around, whether you're a student or a teacher, to think about what organizations are already doing really good work in the community. One organization that I've worked with that I really like is Groundwork Denver. They have a kind of community-based environmental justice orientation. They do things like work in lower-income neighborhoods to make available energy audits and energy efficiency home retrofits. They also do they have a big greenhouse and do grow food and distribute it for free to local communities. We have in Colorado Springs, where I work, an organization called Food to Power. It's a food rescue organization, but they also are focused on, they've developed a food hub where they have a big garden and they distribute food there too, and they also have a youth education program. Also in Colorado Springs, thanks to a lot of community activism, the downtown coal-fired power plant was shut down much earlier, retired basically, much earlier than anticipated, the Drake power plant. So I think finding local examples of ways in which change is happening can be really helpful. And centering climate justice and really thinking about how transitions from a kind of fossil fuel dependent economy to a decarbonized economy might work in a way that doesn't further exacerbate impacts on BIPOC and frontline communities, I think is really important. And then lastly, I think this idea of scaffolding active hope, I think, is valuable. So one of my colleagues, Simona Capasani, teaches a class on climate ethics and climate justice. And in that class, she actually has a section of the class that focuses on emotion. So focuses on anger, focuses on hope, focuses on some of the emotions that anxiety, climate anxiety, many of the emotions that I think a lot of us who are concerned about climate change actually are grappling with and trying to figure out, what to do with. One of the pieces that she teaches in that class is by Victoria McGeer. And I think I really like this piece because McGeer talks about this idea of active hope, right? And I think sometimes it's easy to conceptualize hope as just sort of like sitting, sitting down, like drinking a cup of tea and sort of wishing the world were different, okay? But McGeer's conception of hope actually is focused on the relationship between hope and agency. So as she puts it, and this is a quote from McGeer, hoping is a matter not only of recognizing, but also of actively engaging with our own current limitations in affecting the future we want to inhabit. It is, in other words, a way of actively confronting, exploring, and sometimes patiently biding our limitations as agents rather than crumpling in the face of their reality. So active hoping is actually figuring out, like, what am I hoping for? What kind of world am I hoping for? And what are the obstacles to bringing that world into being? The other, I think, really nice aspect of her piece, so in addition to, I think one of the things about this agency-centered conception of hope is that it suggests that good hope is active and engaged. And then McGeer also emphasizes the sociality of hope, and in particular, how hope can be scaffolded by the support of others. So active hope can be strengthened when we support and engage with one another's hopes and when they engage with ours. So, you know, what kind of world are you hoping for? How can we help bring about that world? And vice versa, right? So when we get together, we can think about our collective hopes and think about how we can support one another's hope. So in my view, this conception of hope is really empowering, and it suggests that hope's not just an attitude, it's actually an orientation toward thoughtful action. All right, so in conclusion, my suggestion is that we work to cultivate intra and intergenerational relations that can strengthen climate responsibility. And I think that, I mean, just sort of one last thought, which is that if we think about from a relational perspective, we may be able to kind of provoke different conversations about intergenerational ethics and climate change, as opposed to what the kinds of frameworks that are often common and dominant approaches. So in this view, climate action and climate justice would be understood as located in and conditioned by complex histories, thinking about what kinds of worlds we've inherited and whose flourishing is sort of most prioritized and least prioritized in these worlds. It might shift our thinking from asking, do we really owe anything to future generations? Do we really have to save something for them? To what kinds of worlds are we building for current and future generations, and what kinds of worlds might we collectively strive to build? And from how much must we save for future people to what practices might enable current and future people to live well with one another and in relation to the broader world. And that is it. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we have about 10 minutes, a little more than 10 minutes for questions.
And I'll just say, like, if you think I'm crazy, like, and you totally disagree with everything I've just said, I want to hear that, okay? So you don't just have to ask questions that are, like, you know, friendly or clarificatory or whatever. I mean, don't be mean, right? But you know, if you think, like, this analysis makes no sense, I'd love to hear that.
Yes, friendly criticism.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, like we talked about. Well, I think my question has to do, I think maybe it's a twofold question. So I think recently, I don't know whether it was just coincidence, but I felt like I've heard more of these framings of like, right, like, can we have democracy and like address climate change, right? There's this kind of general sense that maybe China is doing better, right? And I think, I mean, I've personally been a little bit annoyed by this framing, like partially I think because I think it presupposes that we have perfect democracies in like Europe and North America, but it does sound that from what you were saying, actually, it seems almost all the paths actually were more democracy, right? Like representing, say, like future generations and past generations differently, like community building, like actually building something that does allow for more participation. So I guess the first part of the question is, right, like, is that kind of like, would you kind of push back strongly against this idea that maybe we need less democracy to solve climate change and maybe we need more? And I guess the other question is, are you familiar with any examples of how democracies give institutional representation to future generations, or is that a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm not going to be able to come up with a lot of great, you know, specific examples, but I think there are ways in which people have, you know, governments at various scales have tried to represent, you know, have representatives of the future. And, well, here's one example that's not yet hasn't yet come to pass. But one of the things Steve Gardner argues for is a global constitutional convention for future generations, basically like a global coming together to actually try and agree on some fundamental principles about what is owed to future generations that would then inform the development of, institutions at various levels. With respect to the democracy and climate change question, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of pro-democracy, and I mean, and I mean that in like a sort of small sense. Like I think at many different levels, I think we probably need more democracy. I think we do have challenges associated with. I mean, we talked about this a little bit, but like, the way in which people are kind of occupying different epistemic worlds, like depending on, my newsfeed versus somebody else's newsfeed, and how that leads people to maybe not have kind of common, like a fundamental shared baseline for conversation. So I think there are challenges, but I don't really think there's any, I don't think there are shortcuts, honestly. I feel like we have to be able to talk to each other. We also, if people aren't at the table, like if we don't have good representation of diverse communities at the table, I think those communities are not gonna be well considered, I guess. I'm kind of also, I guess, in the camp a little bit with Kyle White, who wrote a paper on like ecological and relational tipping points in relation to climate change, and he talks about how basically just responses to climate change require the cultivation of, reciprocal, trusting, accountable relationships among people, and without that, we're not going to have robust and just responses. So I see the question back
I joined a little late, so just summarize this shortly if it was covered. But in terms of handling climate change, would you agree that transferring from fuel-ran vehicles to completely electric vehicles is reasonable? And if it is, how would we go about doing it?
So the question is about shifting to electric vehicles. Is that right? Yeah. I mean, the reality is I think it is going to happen. I mean, California just set some really ambitious policies about for electric vehicle targets. I forget the date, but like they basically set a date, I think, after which all vehicles, don't quote me on this, the exact policy, but they're rapidly moving to require a huge percentage of car sales be electric vehicles. And we've seen in the past that when, they've had influence on national policy in the U.S. through setting more not through on national policy, but also on automakers, actually, directly on automakers through setting sort of more, higher fuel efficiency standards and so on. Like, different car companies don't want to make like, the inefficient car for this state and the more efficient car for that state. So I think that is going to happen. I think there are also, challenges, justice issues. I mean, there are obviously issues associated with mining the metals needed for electric car batteries. So that is an issue that needs to be carefully attended to. And I mean, I also think we should keep the space open for thinking about different modes of transportation, right? Like, it doesn't have to be all, we have in the US especially, we have a very single, passenger car kind of vehicle-centered infrastructure, but we need to rebuild a lot of infrastructure, and so we could be creative in how we do that, in developing more train systems, for example.
Would you think it would be easy for automotive companies to switch to completely electric?
I mean, I think and that's probably a better question for them than for me. But I mean, I think there's a lot of trend in that direction. I mean, I think a lot of, I don't know. I think a lot of companies are sort of seeing the writing on the wall, and they're also, transitions happening in other countries. So I don't know easy, but I think it's likely that it will happen in, the next 1, 2, 3 decades.
I guess for me, my question on the subject of electric cars, one argument I hear often against electric cars is that the mining for the lithium batteries is worse for the environment and for climate change than actual fossil fuels. And I guess my question, I'm not really knowledgeable enough on fossil fuels and also the mining of lithium batteries to understand both points of view. So I'm sure you know more than I do. So
yeah, I mean, I think this is a matter of, I've heard those same arguments. I think the life cycle analyses that I've seen suggest that, well, one thing is it depends on how the car is used, right? So if you have like a family that has 2 cars already, and then they buy a third electric car because there's like great incentives for, especially for wealthy. Yeah, I mean, tends to be wealthier people who can afford to buy these cars that benefit from some of these incentives. But then they only drive that car like occasionally. There's a lot of cost of producing the car and producing the battery. So I think part of it depends on how the car is used and what lifetime of the car. But from the studies I've read, it's not like across the board the case that electric cars are necessarily worse than fossil fuel powered cars. Also depends where the electricity is coming from, right? Like if you're burning fossil fuels to produce electricity, you've got coal-fired power plant that's charging your battery. That's a different situation than if you're powering the car off of renewable energy.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so my question is regarding how do you recommend we best address interclass approach to environmental change? Because it seems to me environmental change is a lot more easy for the rich to go about it. It's more expensive to buy electric vehicles, or they have the money to be able to afford the time to maybe take the more more environmentally friendly routes to approach life. Do you know how you would best suggest making environmental change friendly for more people in the populace?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a big question. And so there's so much, potentially to say about it. I mean, I do think certain things will become more, I don't love this response of my own, but I'll give it anyway, as a partial answer. Like, certain things will become more affordable through economies of scale, so like electric cars like expensive now, but I think they'll become more accessible to people over time. That doesn't immediately address the class issue, the availability of used electric cars and stuff like that. More fundamentally, I do think doubling down on the democracy thing, and representing, communities that, not having politics sort of primarily represent wealthy communities would help. I do think there are some efforts in the current administration, in the Biden administration, to center environmental justice more strongly and to commit resources to that in the, Inflation Reduction Act, which was sort of a successor to the Build Back Better bill. There are grants, specifically sort of EJ, environmental justice focused grants for communities to engage in climate-related action and climate adaptation and things like that. So it's imperfect, that law also has some problematic dimensions to it. But, raising those kinds of questions like you're doing actually in repeatedly keeps it visible and hopefully will lead to greater institutionalization of responses that address class issues in relation to climate. Yeah. I mean, I could say more about it and adaptation and stuff, but I think I should stop. Yeah.
I have a similar question to hers, but regarding kind of international scale.
Yeah.
There's definitely an argument that I've heard going around where industrializing nations find it hard to justify taking environmental measures when every nation in the world has industrialized on the back of like coal power.
Yeah.
So what do you think about the weight of responsibility? Do you think that we need to take some measures to incentivize that development into greener energy or greener industrialization?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's totally unfair for countries like the US to say, you know, the fair response to climate change is that everybody cuts their emissions by the same amount, for example. You know, the US has been like a total obstacle and foot dragger on this in international negotiations. You know, like the Kyoto Protocol fell apart because, you know, in part because the U.S. was very resistant to binding obligations on industrialized nations and giving more space for poorer and less industrialized nations to develop. And yeah, I mean, there's one point U.S. climate negotiator said, if equity's in, we're out. You know, that's pretty blunt. So yeah, I mean, I really think the countries that have the greatest capability, that have contributed the most, like, need to step up. There are things that technology transfer. I mean, there are ways in which it's possible. You know, there's an international adaptation fund. There are definitely ways in which wealthy countries that have benefited from fossil fuel emissions could contribute to enabling greener development and enabling climate adaptation in ways that would be, you know, that would be more just than what we've got going on now. But yeah, I guess I'm agreeing with the intuition behind your question, if I understand it correctly.
Okay, I think we're out of time, unfortunately. So if there are other questions, please feel free to talk to the speaker after. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you very much.